This is Winchester Academy.
Okay, before we begin, can everyone hear my voice well? Yes. Perfect.
How about mine? Good?
All right. So each of you should have a packet. If you do not have a packet of materials, please let us know. We will provide you with that. We have a few that need packets. Okay, I hope we have enough. We definitely have enough papers, but I hope they're organized enough. Okay. If you need a writing utensil, let us know. So I know that as accustomed to some of the past presentations, it's been a lot of presenting, but today we're actually going to have you have some personal reflection time in regards to poverty, because it's a really important piece of what we're trying to provide as far as an experience with learning about poverty and opening our minds about a very difficult, complex topic. So some of that will require a pen and some paper. I'm going to just pause for a moment to make sure that everyone has what they need. Obviously, everything is your choice, what you participate in. I think I'm cut out for a second. Can you hear me again? Yeah. Wonderful. Just a couple more. Okay. So there's just a couple of people that need the packet, but I'm going to get started real quickly. So before we even introduce ourselves a little bit more and the topic, I want you to find the piece of paper. It should be either a green piece of paper, regular sized, or a little card. And this is what we call the personal reflection. I want you to think about your first experiences with poverty. This may be a personal situation. It may be something that you experienced from others. It could be when you were younger, most recently, and reflect on that. So only complete the first two questions. I need to take a technology pause here. How do we get to the next slide? I'm on the slide feature. Maybe up there? That's not changing on the screen. Yeah, okay. Perfect. Thank you. So the first two questions. And as we're doing this, I like to share my first experience with poverty. I was a young child, did not grow up I had basic needs met, so I did not understand that young children could be homeless or hungry or in poverty. And there was a made-for-TV movie based on real life. And it was about a family that experienced a fire in their home, and they did not have the social support or anywhere to go. They ended up homeless for the rest of the children's childhood. And that bothered me significantly. Even as a young child, I had a really high sensitivity to the situation. And so I think that was my first real experience, and yet it wasn't a firsthand experience. So the emotion I did feel was I felt anxious. I wondered if it could happen to my family, if it could happen to anyone, given the right circumstances, and I felt worried about the children that may be homeless. So at a very young age, that had an impact on me. Christie, do you have anything to share? We do work with quite a few families that experience poverty firsthand, so some of our stories and some of our experiences come from that as well.
Yeah, the first memory that I have is a trip to Chicago, walking down the street and in the evening seeing some individuals who were camping out on the sidewalk for the evening. And similarly to Amanda, my instinct was, how do I help them? What do I give them? there's got to be something on my back that I can give them, that they could use. And I think that kind of mentality brought me to this role, this career.
Great. Does anybody have anything they'd like to quickly share as an experience? Something that was a big aha moment? You're not required to. I thought I saw a hand.
I recall never having any purchase
I'm actually
clothing.
going to give you, so everyone can hear.
I recall never having any purchased clothing, that my mother sewed everything I had all through high school.
So we're actually going to end this presentation with a small activity. You do not have to get out of your seats. And that is one of the components or one of the questions on the activity is if you had hand-me-down clothes. And that's not always a sign of poverty, but that can be a part of it. So thank you for sharing. All right. Apologies for the fuzz while I get this on my scarf. Okay, so introductions. We are with Extension, University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. I am in Fond du Lac and Sheboygan counties. I have two roles. One of my roles, Food-Wise Coordinator, really brings me in touch with many families in poverty. And a part of that is not only working with families in poverty and teaching life skills and some of those important pieces to help them get ahead in self-sufficiency, but also we work with community agencies on building awareness of poverty in the county and the community, ways to address it, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those, the way we present poverty. We'll get into more detail, but that is who I am.
Yeah, and I'm Christie, and I work in the Wapaka County UW Extension office for the Food-Wise program as well, and I've been in Wapaka County for 5 years, and then 2.5 years ago I absorbed the Calumet, Outagamie, and Winnebago counties in the Food-Wise program also, so I'm seeing the different dynamics of the counties and the poverty that each county has. It's very, very different.
So we do have more information on the back table about our programs. There's so much more to Extension than what we're presenting today, or than just the Food-Wise program. The Food-Wise program works with individuals on SNAP, which would be food stamps or food share, as we call it in Wisconsin. So most of our families are eligible or on food share. And we teach, as I said, life skills specifically around nutrition and health related areas, in addition to the poverty work that we do with our agencies. This one is the slide turner is a little different than I'm used to. Okay, so a real quick background about our curriculum. So how many are you, I'm going to actually just ask this right now, how many are familiar with Ruby Payne? One, okay, I thought there would be more. Two? So that's two. Okay, so there is an individual that, Ruby Payne, who has a lot of materials out there in regards to poverty and hunger, and her experiences with it. And it is a great curriculum. Since there's only two, I won't get into as much detail, but in some communities have learned quite a bit about Ruby Payne, and it's very embedded into the past teachings. So for many years, Extension taught Ruby Payne materials. Now we have moved away from Ruby Payne, for those that are familiar, and we now work on a curriculum called Poverty Awareness for Community Engagement. So Ruby Payne was very observational, which is neither right nor wrong, but those were her observations. PACE, we like to call it, is based on data and based on an experience. So what I mean by that is, it really is a spectrum. Every individual in this room may be in a different place with poverty. Some may be at the personal reflection stage, where you may be just beginning to think about your experiences with poverty. Others may be actually in the action stage. So you're in your community, whether it's a volunteer role, whether it's a work-related goal, and you're making change happen related to poverty. We understand that all of these pieces are important. They build upon each other. So today, in a very, very short amount of time, we are going to focus on just some of the very beginning stages of this. PACE, we like to call it, is similar to like a toolbox with various tools. What I mean by that is there's quite a bit of activities, ways to teach about poverty. And we're choosing just one, very introductory piece. How many of you have participated in either a hunger or poverty simulation? So more of you in the room. So a poverty simulation is another tool from the PACE toolbox that we offer in the community. And that is much more in depth than this basic presentation. Many times this presentation comes before a poverty simulation. A poverty simulation is 4 hours long and requires you to really dedicate your time, but you also learn a significant amount by the end, or gain from the end, or in the end. So I just wanted to give a little bit of an idea of the curriculum and where we're coming with this. We also are very privileged at Extension to be able to work with some of the state's leading researchers and experts on these issues. So nothing we're sharing isn't fact-based or based on research and data. Anything else? Real quickly, I know Christie most recently offered a hunger simulation called the Community Food Challenge at the Wapaka Area Food Pantry. Did I say that correctly? Great. That would be another tool within this toolbox. I have an example of a flyer in the back, so if your agency or an agency or organization that's interested in stepping up the conversation around poverty, just let us know. So as I mentioned real quickly, today's objectives are to cover a very complex topic in a short amount of time. So we're going to think about our first experiences with and perceptions of poverty, which I mentioned is the personal reflection. You're going to learn a little bit more about how poverty is measured and defined, which we like to think of as critical and knowledge and critical thinking, so we're providing some of that context or data. You're also going to learn about localized data. We actually, once again, privileged to work with some of the state's leading researchers on data and statistics, so we can get very, very localized data on many things. So we have some of that information for you. We will examine how your personal life circumstances have shaped your personal paradigms. What we mean by that is your perceptions of poverty are based on your experiences, and they're neither right nor wrong. They are yours, you own them. So we would like to help coach you on thinking about those a little bit more. Learn the impacts of poverty. I will mention this again, poverty is more than just about money, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then action. So what are those steps that you're willing to commit to before you leave in your personal life or work-related life?
So as we will learn this evening, poverty is defined in many different ways by different people, and we, like Amanda said, we have our own experiences that have really defined our feelings and values and perspectives of what poverty means. And so we just ask that, this evening we create a safe space that, like Amanda said, there's we're not here to prove a right or a wrong, but just that we create a safe space to be able to discuss this with an open mind. So, what is poverty? And that's what we want to start our presentation off with, or kind of before we really dig deeper. What does poverty mean to you? What does poverty look like to you?
So we're actually asking the group, what does poverty mean to you? Does anything come to mind?
Maybe some of these pictures.
Just shout it out. Hunger.
Shelter.
Homelessness. Shelter.
Lack of choices.
Lack of choices.
A kid with no money to go on the field trip.
Okay. No money to go on a field trip. So maybe some of those extracurricular activities.
People who struggle with normal household bills, like now you hear the warnings, they will turn off your electricity.
Sure. So able to kind of meet our basic needs, pay for our basic needs.
AODA issues?
Alcohol and drug issues.
Joblessness.
No job.
Well, health issues?
Health issues.
Did you say health or mental health?
Mental health.
Mental
Okay.
health.
Transportation in this area.
Yeah, lack of transportation, absolutely. Yeah.
Lack of skills.
Lack of skills. Just overall, maybe lack of education.
Can you clarify on skills?
Part of skills. Lack of knowledge, lack of skills, and maybe physical ability or mental ability.
Physical or mental ability, so just a level of education.
Poor hygiene.
Hygiene. No insurance. Poor physical health. Okay. Yeah. Lack of ability. So, yeah.
Frequent moves.
Moving households often and lack of ability. Can you speak a little more to that?
No car.
Oh, sure. Mobility.
Mobility.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did I miss anyone?
Clothing?
Clothing.
Oh, clothing. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a
I think
really
we have a very
good
comprehensive
list. And as we have these pictures up here, just as maybe if you close your eyes and you're visualizing, some of you describe something kind of similar, you know, the clothing, the physical, or the hygiene, health, shelter. That picture up on the top left is a picture of, you know, somebody who probably does not have a roof over their head. And a line at the food pantry, maybe all things that we think about when we think about what does poverty look like.
So before we move forward, how many of you have seen this in Wapaka County? What have you seen? I'm interested.
All the above.
You've seen all of them? So you've seen, many times homelessness especially is a little hidden to the community, is what my experience is. So you've seen homeless individuals out in the, wow, okay. So we know it exists in our community, but how, you know, how deep, what are the, you know, what's the data and the, I guess the circumstances around it and the consequences of it, so, okay, good. So we have our images of poverty, our ideas of poverty, and once again, they're not right nor wrong, they are yours. But there are times in life when we need a real definition or measurement of poverty. And so there are two approaches that are taken. The absolute approach is really creating a standard for basic needs, especially like when looking at income, and comparing that to the level of resources you need to meet those basic needs. So how many of you, I'm not even going to ask you if you're familiar with it, how many of you have used the federal poverty levels in your work? Just a few. How many of you are familiar with it? Okay, so there's quite a few that are not familiar with it. So I'll talk a little bit more about the federal poverty level guidelines, which make up the decisions for many, many things in our life that our families are using or accessing. So once again, that's taking a monetary look at basic needs and what are the resources that an individual or family needs to meet those basic needs. The relative approach is really tied to society norms. So what is poverty in Wapaka County may not appear to be poverty in, I'm going to use Africa. I really dislike doing that, but I think that's something people can kind of relate to, some of the things they've seen on the news. So this one really is subjective. Yep. So as we go through our presentation, you're going to see us use both of the approaches. We'll flip-flop our uses for those approaches. Okay, so you have in your packet the Federal Poverty Guidelines. It is a white sheet. It looks like a chart. There's actually one on each side. It is not the Alice in Waupaca County. It is actually,
It's like this.
yep, thank you for holding it up. What I would like you to do privately, you do not have to share, is find your number of persons in your household and line that up by your, find your income in a year. Then you will move up from your income and you will see the percentage, you may see the percentage of your, where you are with the federal poverty level. If you are off the charts, that means you make more than the chart really captures. Is anybody having any issues with finding their percentage? Okay. I'm just going to ask once again, how many of you knew this about yourself? You know your, okay, a few of you. Okay. So, to put this in context, the U.S. government uses the Federal Poverty Guidelines with most of the programs, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but most of the programs that our families in our community are using. And can anybody kind of guess what approach they're using with this? Absolute or relative? Absolute. Absolute. So the answer is absolute. But I will describe a little bit more how the relative approach is affecting the predetermined federal poverty level guidelines. So poverty status is determined by, once again, similar to the absolute approach, taking pre-gross, so this is pre-gross annual household income, and comparing it to a poverty threshold. That poverty threshold would be the amount you would need as an individual or family to meet basic needs. The poverty line is intended to reflect the minimum income a household needs. So not the medium amount or maximum amount, but the minimum. In order to achieve an adequate standard of living. So once again, this is not about living life lavishly, it's about meeting basic needs, housing, food, clothing. So for example, if you are at the 200% federal poverty level guideline, if you are a family of one, you would need to make $24,980 in a year to meet basic needs. Do we know families that are one person that may make less than this? Can you think of situations? I know I can. Yeah. So if you're a family of four, to meet the 200% federal poverty level, you would need to make $51,500. So once again, I can think of situations in families of four that are not making $51,500. Yeah. So I'm going to put this in context. The median income in Waupaca County is $54,071. So you are just, for the median amount, average amount per family. Of course, there's families much lower and much higher. But on average, your families are just making it. That's pretty shocking. By $3,000? Okay, so about the federal poverty guidelines, as I mentioned, this criteria is used across the board, across the nation, for various services. So for example, to participate in WIC, a family would need to be 185% or less of the federal poverty level. to be on food, and Badger Care actually. Let me lump that into one. Badger Care and WIC, 185% or less. Food share, which is the Wisconsin name for food stamps, a family would need to be 200% or less of the federal poverty level. And these vary for other programs as well. So when a family walks into a WIC office or a food stamps office, this is the first thing they check, is eligibility, what we call eligibility. Or better yet, many times families call a hotline and go through quite a few hoops to even get a hold of someone to talk to. And this is the first thing they check, is income. 1 second. WIC. What does it stand for?
Women, Infants, and Children.
Yes, thank you
for that.
for that.
It's a program that's in every county, and they serve prenatal women to age 5 postpartum.
Great, thank you. If I'm using any language that we are so accustomed to working with, just please raise your hand. I really appreciate that. Never assume everyone knows everything, and that's great. Real quickly, so there are some issues with the federal poverty guidelines, and can you guess what some of those issues are?
The base level of income is very different than what it costs to live in the area.
So that very good answer. This is used nationwide, except for Alaska. So of course, Alaska, everything is flown in, or there's increased cost to everything, so it's not a comparison. But really, is Wisconsin a comparison to the wealthiest county in Connecticut? Very different, and this is used nationwide. So that is one of the concerns. Can anybody else think of anything?
How often is that updated?
It is updated annually to adjust for cost of living, yes. But I think you're alluding to one of the concerns, is this tool was developed in the 1960s. So although the cost of living and the numbers are updated to an extent, in the 1960s, families spent 1/3 of their income on food, for example. Now they spend 1/5 to 1/6. Where do you think 1/3 of their income goes towards? Housing. Significant cost for families. So how costs are broken up per month is not even a comparison to the 1960s. So if this was actually updated to be more current, in a current reflection of the monthly expenses that a family really needs to pay for basic needs, many more families would be in poverty. Many, many more. In fact, probably so much more that we would not be able to meet all of the needs through services, is my guess. That's just my guess. I'm no factor. That's just a general impression.
All right. So I'm going to dig a little deeper on the actual definition of poverty here. So we've given you the dollars behind what it means to really, be in poverty. But definitions, having an income below a federal determined poverty threshold, like Amanda was just talking about. The federal government estimates at the point below which a family of a given size has cash income sufficient to meet basic needs, like we've said. Any family or individual with a total income less than the amount deemed to be sufficient to purchase food, so those basic needs. The state of one who lacks a usual or societal acceptable amount of money or material possessions and an insufficient means to provide in a socially acceptable manner that the basic necessities of a daily life in order to live healthfully. It's a mouthful. So there are a lot of definitions, and we really kind of went over most of those in the previous slides. But some of the definitions include judgments, and so going back to the two ways to view poverty, the absolute or the relative. And so looking at these definitions, what we're considering to be socially acceptable, what are we looking at when we're talking about those two kinds of poverty, the relative or the, is that a factor? Is it opinion based on judgment?
And we normally wouldn't throw a bunch of definitions at you, but I think it just drives home the point that our impressions are important, our views on poverty are important, and that would be relative. But we also have to determine a way to define if a family is actually in poverty. So I'm just going to ask real quickly in regards to the relative and absolute. How many of you, what would you use at work? You know, if you were working with families that were low income, which would you use, relative or absolute?
I use the relative.
You would use the relative. Describe why you would use the relative at work.
Okay, a lot of times, just because you're at a certain income level, doesn't mean that you aren't on that other side where you need the help.
Okay, that's very good. What would you use in your personal life, relative or absolute?
Relative.
Relative too? Okay. So when I've done this presentation before, many people, and once again, there's no right or wrong answer, many people say that they've used the absolute approach at work, but I think sometimes it depends on the crowd that I'm working with. I may be teaching a social services agency. I may be working with a school, and they're looking at free and reduced lunch, school meal program eligibility. It really depends on the audience. But then what we find is when families or individuals leave work and they go home, they may drive around and they may see a house that doesn't look like theirs, and they may think they must be in poverty. So they make a judgment or a call without knowing a lot of information. And so once again, that's using the relative approach. But it's very interesting, thank you. I saw a hand up in the back.
Well, I hear people my age say, well, I'm on a fixed income. But they also have a house, 2 cars, and so I mean, if you're 72 and making a certain salary, it would seem to me you're less likely to be in poverty than if you're a 22-year-old couple just starting out and don't have the support. So if you're going to be that legalistic about it, it's not fair.
Okay, very good comment. Thank you. So some of that sounded relative, but very good comments. Thank you for the, oh, sorry.
How would you know to say on not the relative, but the other one? Absolute.
So really that,
Somebody else's income.
no, in your everyday life, you would not. I think why we discuss this is the relative approach. I think there's a lot of room for error. Without knowing an individual's income in your personal life, there's a lot of judgments and just experiences that we have in our personal life that shape how we think about poverty, and yet we may not know the information, all of the information about a given individual. So that's why we like to discuss it a little bit more. Did I answer your question? But then there are times, especially for those of us that do work with families, we do know their income, or at least enough about their income that indicates that they are on certain programs. Okay, so I don't like to provide a lot of data. We have so much out there. If you are interested in learning more about the statistics and data, there's actually some handouts on the back table. There are 2 specifically that I'd like to call attention to. One is called the Poverty and Food Security Profile. It's more of a stapled packet. That is through the Applied Population Lab at UW-Madison. And it's I'm going to just forewarn, it is slightly outdated because we are waiting on new census data. There will be a 2020 census, which means that we will have new profiles soon. So if you do have concern about the year on the profile, that is out of our control. But we still want to share with you some of the areas that these profiles cover. There's a lot of wonderful information in the profiles.
And it's Wapaka specific.
And it's Wapaka specific. There's also another piece of paper over on the table, which is called ALICE. This is more current. And this is, I will describe what ALICE means in a little bit, so that will be a mystery for you unless it says it on the sheet. I'll discuss that a little bit more. So everything that we are discussing today is based on what we call the ACS, or the American Community Survey, and this is the most frequent census data time points that we have access to, that anyone has access to. Across the nation, so 2013 to 2017. So if we have any data, the most current is 2017. So the Wisconsin poverty rate in general is, and this has been a trend throughout many years, is in general lower than the nation, at 12% poverty. That is 45 million, well actually 46 million people. So 12% seems like a generally small number. It's not. That's a lot of individuals. Wisconsin, sorry, 15% is 46 million, apologies. Wisconsin is 12%, once again, generally lower than the nation, as I mentioned. That is 693,000 people in Wisconsin live in poverty. In Wapaka County, you are just slightly below the Wisconsin number, which means that there's, and of course adjusting for population, there's about 5,500 individuals in Wapaka County that live in poverty. Is that surprising to anyone, or is that something that you are aware?
What percentage is it? 11.
Yeah, 11%. So poverty rates vary by county. Yes? You think that's low? So let me, I will describe this more in detail in further slides. This is not including what we call ALICE families. This is including individuals in extreme poverty. So we actually break up that 11% to be families in poverty and families in extreme poverty. So there's actually two different numbers for that, but it does not include the ALICE families. So before we move on real quickly, so poverty rates do vary by county. As I mentioned, we have access to the poverty rates across the state for every county. We also have very localized data in which we can find the poverty rate by census tract. That means we take a specific population and we can find the poverty rate by almost a census, like a block, which is very impressive data. And it's broken up by racial ethnic group. So if you're interested in that, Christie would have that for you for Wapaka County.
Does the King, the Veterans Home at King, have does that apply, or are they included? Is that what helps bring our number as high as it is?
Yep, it is. Would be included in the overall number. And when, like Amanda said, when you're looking at those particular geographic areas, when you zoom in on a map and you're looking at the poverty or at the racial and ethnic diversity, you can kind of, try to think about what is that area, what is this pocket, and, oftentimes like, oh, that's King's Veterans Home. So yes, it is included, with some exceptions to some of the data that we have. So overall, usually yes.
So if that were taken out, chances are our poverty rate would be lower.
I think that's a tough assumption to make. I'm not familiar with the local area as much. It sounds like that's a pretty large group, yes. But that also is an assumption I don't think we're comfortable making. I wouldn't be comfortable making that in Fond du Lac County, saying if we took out a certain population, how that would affect the total number. So does anyone have an idea where poverty tends to be the highest in Wisconsin?
Menominee County.
Did you see my notes?
No.
I have never.
I'm familiar with the reservation.
I have never had anyone get that correct. So good job, wow. Most people say Milwaukee County. Most people identify poverty with urban areas. Once again, that's not incorrect. But Menominee County, a very rural county, actually has a higher poverty rate than Milwaukee County. So Menominee County has a poverty rate of 27%, and the second highest is Milwaukee County at 20%. So we could do a whole entire other presentation on rural poverty and how that differs or is similar to urban poverty. I think rural poverty is much more hidden. It's something that you don't see as well as urban poverty. Urban poverty usually has some segregation and class differences more so associated with it than rural poverty. But rural poverty is so much more prevalent than I think the average, than the community member realizes. So there's a lot of information and data and more conversation around rural poverty than ever before, because we're finding it has a lot of health effects and negative effects on community members in rural areas.
Yeah, and Menominee County always has the highest unemployment rate.
Does it?
In the state.
Okay, well, many times, not always, but many times that can go hand in hand. So the lowest poverty rates in Wisconsin are in Ozaukee, Waukesha, and Calumet. They have poverty rates of 5%, and Washington County is 6%. So there's no county that has 0% poverty, unfortunately. If you took the total number of people in each of these, once again, similar to what we did with the nation, the state, and Wapaka County, it may be a lot of individuals still in poverty, but those are the lowest. So real quickly, I mentioned that poverty is different by county. It's also different by group. So poverty does not affect every group the same. I think a good example would be some of the segregation or some of the differences that I mentioned in Milwaukee County that you can see. It's a little bit more visible to the eye. But in the 1970s, actually let me back up. Prior to the 1970s, can anybody guess? I'm going to have you guess rather than just tell you. Can anybody guess what the population or age group that tended to be the highest in poverty?
Seniors.
Seniors, exactly. So there were some federal programs put in place in the 1970s that dropped the senior poverty rate significantly. That is not to say there are still not many seniors in poverty. It still is an issue. But due to those policy changes, poverty rates dropped quite a bit for seniors. With that, another population flip-flopped. So there was another age group that skyrocketed in poverty.
Youngsters.
Yes, children. So we just mentioned that Wisconsin has a 12.3% rate of poverty. Children, and this is the case with most counties, you can take that number and almost double it many times. Poverty rate for children in Wisconsin is at 17%, so it's not exactly double, but it's pretty high. Wapaka County, it's 11% for adults, or for the total population, apologies. This is not just adults, total population. 17% for children. So there are 17% of children in Wapaka County living in poverty. Other groups that tend to have higher poverty rates are female-headed households. That can be working. That does not mean unemployed. Specific racial and ethnic groups, and adults over the age of 25 with only a high school education. So the high school education is really a key component in a lot of this conversation. So real quickly also, you have in front of you another report called the Alice Report. How many of you are familiar with the Alice Report? Nobody? Okay. So this is through your United Way. Alice stands for Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed Households. So what is that? That's a really long acronym, but what does that mean? Working poor. Thank you for using the actual terminology. That is exactly what we refer to, working poor. So Wapaka County has a 36% of households struggling to afford basic needs. That means 11% are either poverty or extreme poverty, and 25% are Alice households. So it's really a true representation is 36%. If you have more questions, I would recommend reading the report in front of you. But many times our conversations about poverty leave out the working poor. And especially with the recent recession over the past how many years, working poor became a little bit more prevalent in our community. Families that need food from food pantries that have never needed it before, for example. So real quickly also, I want to talk about limited earnings potential. That is the inability to find sufficient work at an adequate wage. So you may have been hearing, unemployment rates are at their lowest they've ever been, or in, lowest in 10 years. Yes?
Backing up a bit. Now, when you talk about the working poor, is that also including the underemployed?
Yes. So I'm actually going to be speaking to underemployed right now. That's another terminology that we use. So yes, that would include that for the most part. So finding work or finding sufficient work, so finding the employment that pays a decent wage is really many times the make or break to the poverty level. So what we have actually is a pretty neat tool. It's from MIT. What does that stand for? I'm trying to remember. Institute of Technology. Yes, thank you. It's called the Living Wage Calculator. And the Living Wage Calculator shows the hourly rate that an individual, not a family, must earn to support their family. If they are the sole provider and are working full-time. So it has a couple of, criteria in their calculations. So individual, supporting their family, sole provider, and working full-time. So in Wapaka County, a person must make $11.25 to be for a single adult household. That's no children, no spouse or partner. For a single parent household with one child, that almost doubles to 23.66. So a single parent in Wapaka County would need to make almost $24 an hour to meet basic needs. So the Living Wage Calculator actually dives in a little bit further into the dollar amount and how many families in a county are making the minimum wage or the hourly wage that's needed to meet basic needs. As I mentioned, the median income in Wapaka County is $54,771, sorry. So I looked up the most recent labor statistics data, and Wapaka County is at a 2.5% unemployment rate. That's actually pretty low. However, he's chuckling over there. Can you explain your chuckling?
A lot of what they're showing in the unemployment statistics does not include the people who have quit looking for work, or those who have found work but are only working part-time.
So this does not include underemployed, is exactly the point, yes. So there's also been some recent news that although the employment rate across and I'm speaking for the nation, although the employment rate is looking much better, poverty is not going down. And so, why? What people are asking, why is poverty not going down? Underemployment. The hourly wage needs to be a livable wage, is what we call it. Yep. All right, I think I have explained enough about statistics.
And just a little story, just to kind of touch on the Alice description. We hear often in our programs that, because we're working mostly with parents of young children, and so we hear often that childcare is so expensive that they, mom or dad, if it's a two-parent household, one of them can't afford to work because it's too expensive for childcare, and so it's actually, for them it makes more sense for a parent not to work. But then there's one income coming in, and where does that put them on the chart? So just that kind of speaks to that, taking it one step further.
Yeah, and why single-parent households need to make a much higher income than maybe a single adult with all children, yeah. Or even a couple without children. Okay, so we're going to touch a little bit, when we ask about poverty, I was really happy to hear an awareness of other items just than, saying money or income. That usually comes up, but poverty is so much more than income or money. Poverty and the circumstances surrounding it, like hunger, homelessness, they all have direct negative effects, negative impacts on those living in poverty. And actually those that may not be in poverty, but may be surrounded by people in poverty. So when there is a significant difference in an outcome, so let's say a health outcome, let's say cancer rates, for example. When there is a significant difference between populations or groups, so this could be a difference by race, it could be by ethnicity, it could be by age. When there is a difference, a significant difference, so say for example, single female-headed households have a higher rate of cancer. This is not accurate, I'm using it as an example. Than families, than individuals in families. I shouldn't say it that way. Individuals that are married or with a spouse, two-parent households. Thank you, that's a better way to word it. We call that an equity issue. So that it means that there's an inequity. So we like to include this graphic. Some of you may have seen it. Equality, we like to say, is giving everybody, making sure everyone has a pair of shoes. Equity is making sure everyone has the right sized pair of shoes. So poverty is just one equity concern that we do have in our community, regardless of the causes, regardless of the situations that an individual may be in. Families in poverty do not have the same access to certain basic needs than others, or there may be other negative impacts that families with a better income do not experience. And I can talk a little bit more about that. But I'm going to actually just read from the World Health Organization the definition of equity. It's the absence of avoidable, unfair, or remedial differences among groups of people, whether those groups are defined socially, economically, so I'm here to discuss economically, demographically, or geographically, or by other means of stratification. So stratification would be those, like a ladder, those differences in groups. Can anybody, before we move to the next slide, give an example of a real-life example of an equity difference? So the one we work with the most is food. So we know that families that are struggling to make basic needs have higher rates of obesity and overweight. Many people think that hunger looks like thin, frail. In America, that is not what poverty looks like. Poverty in America actually looks like the other extreme. It's unhealthy. It's overweight, it's obesity, because of access to fresh fruits and vegetables and just making, I think somebody mentioned, choices, lack of choices. So there's a general lack of choices in what foods families can buy. That would be an example of equity. Do you have any?
And so I just want to speak to, in Waupaca County, how we're kind of addressing that issue is one of the barriers to accessing fresh fruits and vegetables in the city of Waupaca in the summer is that our farmers market here right outside the building currently does not accept EBT, which is the electronic balance transfer, to run or swipe the food share, the food stamps card. And so I'm a part of a coalition that's working towards actually getting that. We hired a farm market manager, and we're working towards getting that. So that's, we're currently, if you're talking about equity versus equality, if individuals are on food share, they can use that money for fresh fruits and vegetables. So, okay, everyone's equal. But yet, if the farmer's market doesn't accept that, that's eliminating that entire population of individuals in Waupaca County or the city of Waupaca that can't use that money at the farmer's market because there's no way to swipe their transfer. So by creating a way to do that, by getting that card reader, that's equal.
So I think a good example for our program is we work with families. We teach them about choosing healthy foods. Sometimes they look at us and say, I don't have a grocery store within 100 miles of me. And the bus does not pass by my house. I do not have transportation. How can I get this? So another part of our job is actually to, as Christie mentioned, she works with the farmers market. Another part of our job is to work out in the community and how to remove those barriers, or at least reduce those barriers to the point where families then can make choices. Whether they choose it or not, at least they have the choice. So we are making slow change, I would say, but any change is good.
Is it a problem for some people that there are no grocery stores on the east side of Waupaca?
Yeah, and a lot of times you'll hear that those individuals, we call those kind of food deserts, that there is not a grocery store, a larger grocery store within how many miles?
I think they do like 50 miles and then 100 miles, and they'll do increments. So there's actually some mapping and tools for you to identify your local food deserts in your community.
So the individuals that may live in those food deserts are shopping at gas stations, convenience stores. Quick Trips are phenomenal in our county.
Thankfully,
because,
yes.
Yeah, because
Yes.
you can get some produce, you can get
Yeah.
meat, you can get a little bit more than the canned goods, that you can find at other grocery stores, or convenience stores, excuse me.
Well, and I think poverty can be so invisible here, because I've always tried to be realistic about it, but recently a woman surprised me. We were talking about cooking or something, and she said, and I knew she rented in a home, and she said, well, actually, I only have a hot plate.
Only have a hot plate?
Well, and, yeah, so we do in that you're teaching people to cook. A lot of people.
Right, fresh fruits and vegetables are great, but if you don't have a way to cook them, other than the foods that you can eat raw, they're no good to you, and so that's actually.
Cook something instead of just picking up a box and that.
Right.
So I actually, in Fond du Lac County, work with what we call a backpack program. So I'm on a committee that distributes backpacks of food, bags of food. And so some of the food is canned, not all of it. We learned that there were a significant amount of children on this program that did not have a can opener at home. So we had to, because our ultimate goal is to feed children, not to judge families, not to figure out what the reason is that they don't have a can opener. We just want the children to get food. So we actually provided can openers to many of the families. But that's an example of, yes, we do have families that don't have refrigeration space or freezer space even, or a stove or oven. Yeah,
And that's another
it's a
really
very good
great
example
of equity versus equality.
Yeah.
Yep, and something that we want to be mindful of when working with the food pantries too, not to judge why are the fresh fruits and vegetables not being taken. Well, if they only have a hot plate at home, it's kind of difficult to cook with some of them.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much for your comments. Do you have anything else to add to this slide? Okay. So real quickly, let's talk about the impact that poverty has. And I have some arrows up here. So let's take obesity, for example. Obesity does affect the entire population to some extent, the American population. But the relationship between poverty and overweight and obesity is there. There is a direct link. So there's a much greater risk of obesity among women and children, particularly white. So many times you might actually see some health outcomes that are more prevalent in African American populations or Native American populations. This example is in white among white women and children. If families are lower socioeconomic status, they tend to be more likely to have overweight, obesity issues. There are gaps between obesity rates of low, high income groups, but with time that gap starts to slow or close. So obesity is associated with chronic diseases, many chronic diseases. I don't think I have to go through the list. Heart disease, diabetes, and that does affect quality of life and life expectancy. Child development. How many of you are familiar, Wapaka County, you are rock stars in ACEs and trauma-informed care. If you're in that circle of that work, Wapaka County is kind of paving the way, you're smiling. Yes, so trauma-informed care, or actually back up ACEs. ACEs is that toxic stress, so not that really motivated stress that somebody might feel before they take a test. Toxic stress is that ongoing, everyday stress that an individual may experience. And that is children, young children, that affects their brain development. Sorry. How are we doing on time?
We
Real quickly.
need to get
Start wrapping up? Perfect.
Wrap up and Q&A, and
Okay,
if
sounds
you
good.
allow us to pass the
Let me
mic
see.
around.
I have, this is actually the last slide. We have
Okay.
one more activity. We may not have time for that, and that's okay. So we'll just wrap this slide up. So it does affect early brain development, that constant toxic stress. Education. So I use the example of, there's many examples of poverty and it's linked to education or lack of education. But hunger. We know that children that go to school hungry do not learn, are not able to learn the same as children that have a full belly. That affects academic performance, so then affects graduation rates. The home and the physical environment, this one shocks me. And actually, there was a congressman that just, or congresswoman actually, that just brought this discussion to Congress to say why are families not experiencing the same physical environment? Smog, water quality, so lead in the water. Why are these in low-income, impoverished areas? So this is shocking, though, real quickly. So research has shown that those living in disadvantaged neighborhoods have a 50 to 80% increased chance of heart disease, and that is from their physical environment. Then mental health. Once again, you can only assume it's associated with that chronic stress that families live with every day. Nearly 31% of adults who live below the poverty line have been diagnosed with depression at some point, and that is almost twice as high as those that are not in poverty. So there's almost a double. So once again, depression can affect the entire population to some degree, but there's a link. So before we end this slide, none of this is to indicate that children living in poverty are not as intelligent, or people living in poverty are more miserable and depressed than others. This is just showing the research. You can be in poverty and not experience any of these things, to these impacts. You cannot be in poverty and experience some of these things. We're just indicating that there is a relationship, or the research shows there's a relationship between poverty and these negative health outcomes. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. You're a great dynamic team. And we're going to bring the microphones around, and if you have questions, we've got a few minutes for questions.
Great. Any questions? I think everybody's been asking great ones so far.
Way in the back.
Just a comment. I think if the schools would do a much better job of teaching the cost of money and what it means to have a job, I think a lot of the problems might go away.
The need for financial education is definitely something we hear.
No. The schools that teach.
Yes, the financial education in the schools at a young age, yes, correct. Extension in some counties have tried to fill that need by teaching as young as preschool about, what is a dollar? Some kids do not know that a dime versus, because everything's on a card now. So as young as preschool all the way to high school, there's some financial education that's happening that may not be happening in the schools. I hope that changes.
And that
Great
is
remark.
occurring in Wapaka County, actually, the program that Amanda was referring to.
Okay, great.
Along the same lines, I know it's, well, some families, you feel bad for the kids, they don't have this and that or a can opener, but yet families will go to the food pantry and that's okay. But then they got cell phone, cable TV. I don't know if they can use food stamps for cigarettes.
No.
And go to the, okay.
No, definitely
They
not.
used to, and they go to the casino. You know, and
Yep.
too many choices nowadays. Yeah.
So this is, like we said, this is a safe space. You're not neither right nor wrong. It's your observation. And many of us have had the same observations. There's been frustrating points that Christie and I have seen, right?
You know, we get into many of the homes here in the Wapaka area on home visits, and we find that not necessarily true right in the homes. That the cell phones are considered communication that people need
That's vital. That's
today.
vital.
It is
Yeah.
vital. Cable TVs, we found no credit cards that people have, so they're trying very hard to live within their means.
That's our general, I would say, observation is families try. And for example, Wisconsin-wide, most families on food stamps are not on it for life. They're on it on average 12 months. And they are working, most of them are working during food stamp, usage. So there's some data out there to help understand it a little bit more, but it also, the concerns you're bringing up do exist to some degree as well. Yeah.
As a 21-year-old, I was a social worker in Chicago, coming out of a kind of a hate-filled environment. I went to a college that basically taught hate, and I thought it was just terrible when I went to these homes and found that people actually had televisions, and some of them had cars, and that mentality I'm glad I got over. That's blaming the victim, and it just doesn't help anybody. If children can't feel like part of a school by having clean clothes and clean bodies and something in their tummy, they just can't learn anything. And our education system just isn't set up to deal with that. My daughter in Chicago had 45 kids in first grade who didn't speak English. And when school started, they had to start in the laundry room and help the kids bathe and then put clean clothes on.
So is that a disparity?
And give them some
That's a
food.
disparity.
Yeah, but people hate it when folks get help. But people need help. And yet this country, we have all this money for the military, of course, but we can't do anything about the schools. It's sad.
So we have this big long list here, and rarely do we know every individual family that we work with, unless we know their circumstances and can judge or can make a call about reasons. I'm going to just sum it up that there may be more mental health concerns underlying. There may be some AODA, lack of skills. We didn't mention the cycle of poverty. Our activity that we did not have time to do would have actually touched on, we all are born on a level playing field as far as we're all born, but then our path is very, very different, and that shapes our, so if we all start on START, I would ask you a series of questions. One of them is, do you have purchased clothing or do you have hand-me-down clothes? Or are you finding you were using the food pantry? Did you have lack of transportation? And if you had a route towards the green, that means you had some, I don't want to say privileges in life. You had some opportunities that shaped who you are. And personal choice always falls into this. But also, our experiences in our childhood shape who we are. If you were going towards the red, that means you had many more barriers to overcome, which families are resilient, but there's also those barriers. So I think that kind of goes to your childhood and where you come from really shape your adult experiences. Yep. Great.
Well, before we give you a final thank you, I'll just remind those of you who are able to help us stack the chairs, put them in the little trolleys and back into the storage room. That would be a big help.
I actually have one more thing, and I'm sorry, real quickly. You have a couple of additional pieces of paper for us to continue doing our work. One of them is a demographic form. There's also an evaluation. And I think there's one more piece of paper. What is that extra piece of paper? Oh, a call to action. So if you feel like you can take that home too, but if you feel like thinking about what can I do in my community or personal life, you're welcome to fill that out. We had one more.
That was what I was going to ask about.
Thank you very much. The discussion was so rich that I forgot about the paperwork.
Let's give them a nice little packet. Thank you.